Isaiah, stoned to death, sawed in two. Which ought to give one pause before saying too quickly, too easily, too glibly, too unthoughtfully, here am I, send me. So if you're going to preach the message of the prophets, it's helpful to reflect on what it means to be a prophet and the cost that is sometimes paid to be a prophet. The prophets don't deliver all bad news, but because there are rays of hope throughout the prophets. But the bad news does precede the good news. And if you preach regularly from the prophets, you may find there's something of a price to pay. You may not get sawed in two, depends on where you're preaching. But you may not be as popular with individuals in your congregation. You may not get invited to the convention platform. The prophets knew that ministry is often lonely. And it is. We talk so much about Christian community, which is a biblical reality, that I think sometimes we miss something that Dietrich Bonhoeffer stressed in Life Together, which is that Christian community is a reality, but the experience of Christian community is not a guarantee. The community exists, but our experience of the community varies. And Bonhoeffer talked a lot about the need to be able to thrive when you are alone, when you feel alone. I mean, you're never actually alone, because God's always with you. You're never actually alone because you are bonded together in community with other brothers and sisters in Christ. But the fact that you're not alone doesn't mean you never feel alone. And so Bonhoeffer says things like this: if you can't be alone and be okay, you can't be any good to other people when you're actually with them. Because then, the community is just carrying you. You're not contributing anything to the community. So you approach relationship, you approach community from a position of strength as one who can be alone. I don't know that we really do a very good job in equipping people for ministry and helping people deal with some of the loneliness that comes with ministry. But the prophets embody that, and meditating on the prophets and their lives and their ministries is one of the ways that we come to understand that that experience is not unique to us. But Christian leadership is often lonely. You ask any leader who's willing to actually be honest about it, and they will tell you this is true. Sometimes you're just carrying weight that only you know about, and the leader's burden is just to carry that. Sometimes you have to, like the prophets, say hard things, and that is a lonely place to be, people. And if we don't prepare you well for that, or at least do the best we can to remind you that that's out there, and you need to be preparing yourself for that. Because look, among the reasons why many folks don't thrive in ministry or don't continue in ministry is because a part of the difficulty of ministry is a certain kind of loneliness in ministry. And if you're going to preach and teach from the prophets, that's just a part of the deal. All of them experienced it. Does that make sense? So let's talk about the prophet's message. Some of the prophet's message was future from the perspective of the prophet. But most of the prophet's message was not predictive of the future. Now, your millennial position impacts your understanding of the ratios. But from my vantage point, only about 2% of prophetic teaching is really future-oriented.
It really is that small.
At least 2% in terms of future for us.
Yeah.
And a small additional percent was future to the prophet, but past tense for us. Because some of what was future for the prophet is past for us, living the new covenant as we do. Most of what the prophets did was for the sake of the audience in the present. And so they're preaching in present, not future tense. Even what they say in the future tense is to encourage the audience in the present to be faithful. But what the prophets are mostly doing is rather that, you think almost a prophet is saying some brand new message, right? Actually, most of what the prophets are doing, if the prophets had a sermon text, it would be, to a large degree, the book of Deuteronomy. And what the prophets are doing is preaching from Deuteronomy, so to speak, for their contemporary audiences, calling them back to faithfulness in God. Now, you don't see Deuteronomy being directly quoted the way Old Testament is quoted in the New Testament. But here's why that's true. And there are a number of verbal parallels that are just striking, even though you don't get book, chapter, verse. But here's the thing. See, Exodus, the initial audience, the teachings in Exodus, although they're retained for each generation's spiritual nurture, are first addressed to the wandering wilderness generation. Deuteronomy takes some of those same principles and applies them to a different situation once the Israelites are settled in the land. Deuteronomy, written as the Israelites are on the verge of crossing the Jordan into the land of promise, where they are now going to be a settled people. And Deuteronomy is the second generation's Exodus in many ways. The crossing of the Jordan has certain parallels to the crossing of the Red Sea, as they once again do a miraculous crossing into the land of promise. Some of the commands in Deuteronomy are nuanced because they're going to be practiced by people in a settled place rather than wandering around in circles. And the second generation in Deuteronomy 27 and 28 makes a covenant commitment to God. Mount Ebal, Mount Gerizim, priests in the middle, ark, and the people pronounce blessings on themselves if they are faithful to God. Themselves and their descendants. Curses on themselves and their descendants if they are unfaithful to God. That section in Deuteronomy 27 and 28 is really important. All of the book of Deuteronomy is really important. In fact, if different parts of the Bible are significant in different ways. But I think most Old Testament scholars would argue that Psalms, Deuteronomy, and Isaiah are the three most theologically pivotal Old Testament books. And from the standpoint of Old Testament theology rather than biblical theology, just considering Old Testament theology as a category and not quite as much how it connects to the New Testament, within Old Testament theology, Deuteronomy stands front and center. Because Isaiah and Psalms are included in the equation more for their New Testament connections. Much of the Old Testament after Deuteronomy is actually in conversation with Deuteronomy. And so in many ways, it's a theological linchpin in the Old Testament. And the prophets are a major part of that equation. They are not teaching the people new ideas. That's a major misunderstanding with regard to the prophets. They are not mostly revealing anything new at all. They are drawing present day application for their audiences based on the clarifying revelation of God in Deuteronomy. And it especially has to do with this blessing cursing formula. And in the harsh words of the prophets, what they are doing is they are putting Israel under the indictment of violating the covenant commitment made in Deuteronomy, and thus placing themselves outside of God's blessing. But with the promise that that blessing can be restored if they return to covenant fidelity. So as crazy as it may sound, it's hard to really have a good handle on the prophets if you don't understand Deuteronomy. And when you preach from the prophets, even if you don't know it, you're doing a lot more from Deuteronomy than you realize. And if you look in good commentaries on the prophets, prophets, you'll see a lot of references back to Deuteronomy in the cross references. So if you're going to preach effectively from the prophets, making that connection back to Deuteronomy, as well as making connections forward to relevant New Testament connections, may well be significant for you in terms of moving both backward and forward and showing how this all fits together. So since there's so much being done that indicts Israel of breach of covenant, it should be no big surprise that much of the imagery in the prophets has to do with violation of covenant, either through marriage imagery or through courtroom imagery. And so the Reeb oracles in the Old Testament, the courtroom is the scene. And God is judge and prosecuting attorney through the mouth of the prophet who articulates the case for the prosecution. And Israel is the defendant.